There he is. Okay, I think we're ready to go now. Our guest of honor has arrived.
Yay.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Girl Talk Apologetics. This is our second Q&A with an author. Last time we had Greg Kokel's Story of Reality. And before we get started, I just want to quickly remind all of you ladies that we are recording tonight's session and that the recording will be posted on our social media outlets. So if you are particularly shy about being seen, you're welcome to just turn your camera off and stay with us through your audio connection. Also, we're requesting that everyone, except for the speakers, please keep your mics muted throughout the session to avoid any unwanted background noises from showing up on our recording. And we want to thank you for your cooperation. So last week, we finished our 11-week long adventure of reading and discussing Cold Case Christianity together. And tonight we are honored and super excited to welcome as our guest the author of Cold Case Christianity, famous homicide detective and atheist turned apologist, Mr. J. Warner Wallace. Welcome to our group, Mr. Wallace, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And you can unmute yourself because we want to hear you.
Sorry about that. Well, good. Now I can actually talk to you and you can hear me. So I'm glad to be with you guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's an honor. So when we asked the ladies in our group to send in their questions to us by email, they responded with a whole long list of really great questions. So for the sake of time, what we're going to do tonight is my co-hosts, Ann Sands and Susan Morales.
Got it.
Wave, say hello to everybody. Um, they're going to help me present the questions to you in an orderly fashion and as
Okay.
concisely as we can,
Good.
so that we can get through as many as possible in the next hour.
Okay, great.
So before we get started, would you please give us just a brief version of your journey from atheism to Christianity, and also the transition from being a full-time homicide detective to being a full-time Christian apologist?
Well, you guys know my story if you read the book, right? So you know my transition. I became a Christian for all the reasons that I described in the book. And I often will say this. People ask me for my personal testimony, and I say the same thing every time. My testimony does not matter, and neither does yours. Because to be honest, if you ask people around the globe why they are whatever they will almost always tell you the same three things. I was either raised in the system, my parents were this, so I was raised in the church, or I had some experience that I interpreted as affirmation of my worldview. You know, I had an experience of the Holy Spirit that confirmed for me the Book of Mormon is true and Joseph Smith is a prophet of God. You've probably heard that. So it turns out that those two reasons that people mostly give. I was raised in the church, and I've had an experience that demonstrates this is true, are the two most popular reasons why everyone is whatever they are. And that's why I think they're insufficient for us as Christians. So most of the time I just say, well, if you read the book, you'll know that all of those evidences, those things I talk about that are evidential, are actually the reason why I'm a Christian today. And that's really as straightforward as it could be. Now, I haven't transitioned 100%. You never really do when you retire from these positions, especially if I work cold cases. I have two that are still, one just closed. I had a two open when I left, and I'm sure my son will probably open some of mine. I was opening some of my father's, but I still have one that I am consulting on that I think we will solve. And if we don't solve it, we've got a great lead right now that I think will eventually solve the case. But if it doesn't, it'll be open, and maybe I'll work with my son to solve that case going forward. But there's the great thing about having cases that don't close is they don't close. And so I can come back to these years later. But, you know, to be honest, my life is set up right now where I'm so busy that the opportunities I have to come back to these cases is limited. So I do the best I can, but for the most part, hopefully someday my son will work homicide. He's working undercover right now, but I'm hoping that's the next step for him, and then I'll be able to help him solve some of these cases.
Sounds like a very fulfilled life.
It's a busy one, that's for sure.
Yeah. I have your website pulled up here. I want to
Mm-hmm.
share quickly with everyone and ask you to just share what are some of the kinds of resources that you offer people through your website.
Yeah, we try to post 5 times a week. So we post 2 articles a week, 1 podcast, 3 videos. So is that right? Is it 2 articles? That's about right. The reason why it sounds like we have 6 is because our podcast typically is also a video, so you can get that both ways. But so usually on Monday and Friday we post just videos. Wednesday we usually post a podcast, and then on Tuesday and Thursday we post articles. But you'll see that sometimes that changes because my son now is starting to help write these articles, and he's even starting to do videos. As a matter of fact, if you're on Instagram, my son Jimmy, who's 32, he has a site called The Incarnate Investigation, and he's posting videos there. So we're trying to figure out how to pace this, right? And he's also writing blogs that I'm posting on the website. So it gets pretty trafficked. And so it's 5 pieces of content a week. That's our hope. And we've been doing that really for probably 7 years now at this website at coldcasechristianity.com.
Okay. And I will personally recommend anything that pops up if you type $1 apologist into the search bar. Read it all, ladies. It's good stuff.
Yes, that's been when I first started talking about the $1 apologist stuff, my agent said, you really should stop talking that way, because he said, you're going to divide yourself from all the other apologists if you're saying that, hey, there are $1 million apologists out there. Well, there aren't any $1 million apologists, in terms of what the income these guys are making, even Lee Strobel, right? But there are people who we would say have that kind of value to us as Christians. I felt that way about Tim Keller. I felt that way about Lee. And I felt like the rest of us need to jump in, though, because we cannot wait for these 2 or 3 people across the country to do the heavy lifting. We have to kind of all jump in and do our share. And that's where the idea came up that, hey, rather than $1 million apologists, we need $1 million $1 apologists. And that's, that website, somebody who had it just offered it to me, just said, hey, I took your lead and I bought the URL. Do you want it back? And how many URLs can you own, right? So I wasn't sure I could own another one, but yeah, so I'm glad that people are taking that approach and taking that seriously and starting to, be a $1 apologist. I'm glad you're doing it.
Yeah, thanks. All right, well, let's get started with our questions. The first one was from Cynthia, and Cynthia especially appreciated that you included skeptics' arguments as part of your evidential forensic approach, and she wanted to say thank you for undergirding her faith.
Oh, good.
Her question is, have you ever been challenged by any argument put forth by an atheist that gave you reason to doubt?
Well, okay. So after, I went through this process and decided this was true, no, because I had to kind of conquer my own skepticism before, I was that guy who I wasn't like, I was raised as a Christian. Then I discovered there were objections to Christianity. I was the guy who had all those objections to Christianity. So I had to kind of overcome them for myself first. And then I was able to move forward. So I was really familiar with what the other side believed because I was the other side for 35 years. So once I was in, and I haven't, I had to but only because the process that brought me here went over all those objections. and went through all those objections before I could get here. So now that I'm here, I don't have those kinds of concerns, because if I did, I'd probably still be examining those, right? So that's part of one of the advantages, one of the few advantages of coming into the system late. It has its disadvantages also, though, because if you spend 35 years as a non-believer and not even familiar at all, there were no Christians in our lives, no one that we knew that was a Christian. well, then you don't understand the Christian culture, or even it takes a long time to develop new habits, new patterns of behavior, new patterns of thinking. Also, you don't, well, maybe this is a good thing. I didn't really understand the church, why the church does things the way it does, given that I had no like church history. I didn't have a culture I grew up in that said, okay, you speak this way, you do these kinds of things. I was trying to figure out, well, if it's not in the New Testament, ought we embrace it? And I always say it this way: if you were an alien who was flying to the Earth from some other galaxy, and you're getting close, and your adjutant says, "Hey, you know what? We're about to land on the planet Earth. A bunch of Christians there. Would you like to know what they believe?" And you said, "Sure, sure. I guess I should probably figure out what these Christians believe." And so you got a New Testament, and you read through the New Testament to figure out like what Christians believe and probably how they're going to behave. And so you only have the Gospels and the Book of Acts, and you have the New Testament letters. Do you think you'd be surprised when you get here and discover the church actually is the way it is? And then we do church the way we do church, given that the only thing you had was no tradition, you just had the scripture. I think you'd be surprised at the way this actually ended up in 2021 or 2020 now. I think you would. You might say, "Wow, why do they do it this way?" Given that I don't see it this way on the pages of the New Testament. And that was me. I was that guy who had no idea what Christians believed or how they behaved, but I dropped into this at 35. And then I thought, wow, isn't it interesting that the church as it appears on the pages of the New Testament is somehow different than the church that I'm experiencing? And I struggled with that for a while. So I think it is important for us to see that for a lot of people who aren't raised in a system, the language seems different. And then we look at our scripture as a guide. And if you think about how people met and how they lived their lives as Christians in the first century, it's very different than how we do it today. And it was something to think about.
All right. Anne, do you have the next question?
I do. This question is from Donna, and
Okay.
she says, in chapter 9, you wrote, "You never know the impact that a particular piece of evidence will have on those considering your case. Sometimes the things that don't matter to you personally are the very things that matter to someone else."
Right.
Her question is, what was the one piece of evidence that mattered the most to you in your conversion?
Come on now. Donna, you already know the answer to that question. I'm a cumulative case guy. I'm the last guy on the team who will say, okay, I think he did it. And I am that way intentionally because, well, a couple of reasons, but number one, I've been burned before by people I thought were the guy and wasn't the guy. So I'm not going to get burned again. So that's one part. Part of it too is that in the end, I'm going to visualize this for a jury. I'm going to make this visual. I don't know if you guys know my work, but in my public speaking, I speak a language I call visualish, where it's not English, it's visual. And it's entirely visual. So that if I was to give my PowerPoint or my media to somebody else, they wouldn't even know what I'm talking about, because it's not words, it's not bullets, it's not words on the screen. It's how do I communicate this in a way that's powerful, that is entirely allowing imagery to do the speaking for me. Visual connections between pieces of evidence, right? So much so that I know you have to be careful. If this guy's not guilty, there's the opportunity to make somebody look guilty, because visual language is so persuasive. So I have to make sure that my guy is guilty. So I'm always the last guy in. But that means I wait until there's 100 pieces of evidence that point to the guy. And really none of those are really all that persuasive. It's the collection that's persuasive. And that's the way cumulative circumstantial cases work. And this is why defense teams will take that one I talked about in the book. They'll take that one, you got 10 pieces or 100 pieces of evidence that point to our guy. And they'll look at one of those pieces and they'll isolate it and pick it apart. Well, yeah, I get it. That one piece by itself is not persuasive. Don't miss the forest for the trees. You have to be seeing the entire collection and how all the other pieces that point to the same inference make this piece actually strong. So for me, it was the same way. I can't point to one thing. I can tell you what first intrigued me was, I think I talked about in the book. If I haven't, I'll tell you now. It's that I saw there were differences between the accounts, and that is typically a good sign. I was just at a conference over the weekend where I was with another good friend who's a scholar who is looking at the differences between the Gospels and saying, hey, we can explain these differences because there's a genre of biography in the first century that allowed people to exaggerate, change circumstances, maybe say something that's not true in order to make a point. Oh, really? Okay. There's no reason to go there because I have seen differences between eyewitness accounts in every single case I've ever worked, some that are far worse than anything you're going to see in the Gospels. And the thing just happened, 30 years ago. And when they were interviewed, it was only 2 hours old. Yet their interviews, just 2 hours after the fact, documented by different detectives, their statements are going to be, I can tell it's going to spend the next year trying to reconcile these things, trying to figure out why they appear to be describing different things. Yet, in fact, they're describing the same thing. So I've seen that so often that I expect it. I expect the texture of reliable eyewitness accounts to include pretty dramatic differences between the accounts. And when I saw that in the Gospels and that nobody had tried to scrub that out, would have been very easy to do it. You could have waited to the 2nd century, gotten rid of every account or harmonized it the way that Tatian did. So it's not like people didn't try to do that later in history. They did. You could have done that very early in history and just had everything line up. But no, we have different accounts. And the earliest church fathers will tell you that those different accounts simply demonstrate the differences between the perceptions of different authors. The same way it happens in eyewitness accounts. And that really is what got me started. So I can say that's what got me started. But that isn't really probably, that didn't seal the deal, of course. It was all the other stuff I talk about. That's why I have a diagram in the book that describes the cumulative case for the reliability of scriptures.
All right. Susan, what's the next question?
The next question actually comes from me. And it is, in your work as a homicide detective, has the exposure to so much criminal behavior affected your view of the world or your relationship with God?
Well, not so much my relationship with God, but I came in with that view of the world, right? Because I was working these silly cases long before I became a Christian. Does it affect your view of the world? Yeah. I think that not everyone can do this job. And it's not that the job selects out those who can't do it. And I've seen it over and over again. Some homicide scenes are harder to work than others, are more disturbing than others, especially involving kids usually. And if you're the kind of person who struggles with that kind of thing, you're not going to be able to do it. And I've seen guys or gals too not be able to do it because it's just too disturbing. So how I've learned to do this, and I tell this all the time, is that I've just learned to draw the circle in very tight around the people I am willing to cry about. And it's just my immediate family and my dog. But I have a cat in the other room, and that cat's outside my circle. Okay, but the dog is inside the circle. But you have to kind of draw the circle as tight as you can, because you can't get someplace and have somebody who looks like your son on the floor and cry over that kid. You got to work the case. If you don't do it, who's going to do it? So I just have drawn that circle super tight. And I did that before I became a Christian. Now, what struggle is that as a Christian, you're called to open your circle up and to love and care about people that you ordinarily, even the people who don't like, challenge to kind of open the circle up. But I think that's just a skill set that you develop, and then you don't worry about it. You just develop that skill, and then, or yes, it's the kind of person you are, and you're able to do this job. You have to be able to see dead people as things, not as people. And that's one way that which your Christian worldview can probably help, because if Christianity is true, We are soulish creatures who possess bodies. And when our soul is gone, the body's left, but that's just your body. You don't cry over someone's shoes. So why are you going to cry over the body? The soul's already gone. The real identity as soulish creatures is already with God, if they're a believer. And so you don't have to worry about the shoes they left behind on the porch. And that's kind of how you have to see this, or you won't be able to work it. And as far as my relationship with God goes, I mean, I think that's the struggle, is just trying to figure out how to open the circle up. But most people who know me will tell you that I'm the most pessimistic person they know. But that's because pessimism solves cases. If you trust everybody, no one goes to jail. If you don't trust anybody, somebody will eventually go to jail. So it's a matter of, is that a skill set? And you need at least a few people in your world to have that attitude if you want to solve any cases. So I think it's a, I mean, I'm not as much a pessimist about my people inside my circle, but I am more pessimistic, and nothing would surprise me. And so when somebody makes a claim against a leader, a Christian leader who falls, or there's an accusation made against a Christian leader, that doesn't surprise me a bit. And my skepticism says, oh yeah, that's probably what happened. That's just the way we are as humans. But what's great about Christianity is it describes the world the way it really is. And our fallen human nature is described in the New Testament pretty well.
The next few questions deal with engaging culture. The first one is from Alba, and she wants to know, for people who are genuinely seeking truth, are the hardest truths for them to believe usually a single item versus the cumulative case? Or is there something in our evidence or line of reasoning that you consider to be the weakest link and the most difficult to justify?
Well, I think the hardest thing about our case is that we believe there are things beyond the natural realm. And we're in a world that for the most part embraces philosophical naturalism. The idea that something supernatural could be true, that there could be a supernatural realm. And our explanations are supernatural. So we believe that God exists and God's the creator of everything. Well, really? So that's an explanation for the universe. I talk about this in God's Crime Scene. That's an explanation for the universe that lies outside of the natural realm. In other words, we're saying that something other than space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry accounts for why we are here. And in a kind of post-enlightenment world, that's going to be the real thing. Like, you want me to believe that these explanations you're offering as Christians, which are supernatural, are good explanations. So it's really the case against miracles. Could a miracle ever occur? I guess put it this way: if the entire New Testament was written without a single miracle listed, so you have a history of Jesus in the four Gospels. He's an itinerant preacher. He preaches great messages. He gathers disciples. He does sermons like Sermon on the Mount of the Olivet Discourse, all of that stuff. He does all that stuff, but then he dies, and he just dies. Do you think anyone would doubt the truth of the Gospels or the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth? Nobody would doubt it. There's more documented evidence for the life of Jesus than probably any other ancient character in all of history. If you take out the miracles, including the resurrection, the virgin birth, all of that stuff, just take out all the miracles, no one is going to flinch for a second about Jesus of Nazareth. Why do people flinch? Because there's miracles in there. So it shows you that it's what's at stake here is not what's causing this level of skepticism is not the manuscript evidence or the strength of the manuscript evidence. It's the inclusion of supernatural events in a world that has a bias against the supernatural. We are philosophical naturalists in almost everything we do. People say this all the time. Do you think actually when you go into a crime scene, you assume that maybe a demon did it? No, you look for naturalistic explanations. I say yes, but if I ran out of naturalistic explanations, I would certainly go to the next level. I start with naturalistic explanations, and when those dry up, I move on. I just haven't had a case where those dried up. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge we're going to face, is that we're going to face the challenge of people who don't believe in the supernatural. But here's how I always put it. You believe in at least one extra natural thing. You believe that the entire universe, according to cosmology, that is the standard cosmological model called Big Bang cosmology, you believe that all the universe came into existence from nothing. That all space, time, and matter, this is what the claim is of scientists, that all space, time, and matter came into existence from nothing. In other words, there wasn't a big spatial void. Then the universe began. No, there was no void. There was no space. Space is something. All space, time, and matter came from nothing, according to the science. So if there's a cause for this, it's outside of space, time, and matter. And that means it's extra natural, because naturalism is based on space, time, and matter. So you already believe there's a cause that's extra natural. The only question is the cause personal or impersonal? If it's personal, why would you flinch over miracles when you have the biggest miracle in scripture is Genesis 1, not the resurrection. It's Genesis 1, everything from nothing. And that's really, if you already bite off on that, then why would you flinch on the other stuff? So I think we just have to help people see they have a presuppositional bias against supernatural causes, and then help them move past those.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, Anne, you have the next question?
That's a great answer. I'm filing that.
Okay.
Heidi has a question. She says, in a culture that values personal experience and emotions above intellect, how do you start a conversation that requires a logical, systematic way of thinking?
Oh, it's going to get worse. I don't know if you're all paying attention to critical theory, but in the 20s and 30s, critical theory was kind of developed on a number of levels. It now kind of emerges today as critical race theory or racial theory. But that CRT, that critical theory, is changing everything. And one of the premises of critical theory is that lived experience is valued at a very high level over argument. As a matter of fact, argument, they're saying that argument is a form of white supremacy. Seriously, of privilege. The idea of argument to make a case is just a way that people who are in power continue to exercise their power. That we have to instead listen to the voices who have lived experience in the groups that are oppressed rather than the groups that are oppressing. And if you doubt me on this, you can Google. There was a poster created by the Smithsonian talking about how things like logical reasoning are constructs of privilege. So if that's the case, I don't know how we begin to even, first of all, if you're going to argue for that, you're going to have to use an argument. So it's self-refuting in many ways, right? Because you're going to have to argue somehow that lived experience is more important than arguments. But in order to do that, you're going to have to make an argument. So I don't know how you're going to get around that problem. But again, it has come down to the idea that but it's interesting because if I'm in a group, the assumption is that everyone in the group, I'm an older white guy, that every older white guy has the same lived experience. But that's not true. We all have different experiences. And we would say you should never judge a group or never judge an individual basis or never extrapolate to a group the misbehavior of an individual, right? So if one person is burning something down, you shouldn't assume that everyone who looks like that person is tempted to burn something down. Similarly, if one officer does something you find abhorrent, I get it, but you shouldn't assume that every officer does those kinds of things. Again, you don't want to extrapolate to the group the misbehavior of one member of the group. But that's the problem. If everything comes down to lived experience, well, how many do I need? How many lived experiences do I need to know if something is true? I mean, it's a problem. To say that experience, so how I typically will say it is, if that's the case, everyone's got their own lived experience. And you can never adjudicate between two people who have two different lived experiences because it wouldn't be fair. Because people are equally people. Persons are equally persons. To say that your lived experience overrides mine is to say that you're somehow less a person than I am. And that wouldn't be right. So the question is everything a matter of subjective opinion, or are there any objective claims? Now, I'm going to give you a quick primer on this because I talk about it all the time. I just talked about it on Sunday for a church in Tucson. There are subjective truth claims. Subjective truth claims are grounded in subjects, persons. Chocolate chip cookies are the best dessert on planet Earth. Okay, that is my subjective truth claim. You might hold a different truth. You might say you like ice cream better or cheesecake. But I would say the best dessert is X. That's my subjective opinion because I can make it so as the subject. This is a mouse, a computer mouse. Well, my opinion can't change that. I can't say this is a soft drink. It's not going to work. Okay, it's a mouse. I cannot change this reality with my subjective opinion. The subject cannot make it so. This is grounded in the object. Is it a mouse or is it not? That claim is called an objective truth claim because it's grounded in an object, not in the opinion of a subject. The question is, are there such things as objective claims? Is anything objectively true? Or is everything a matter of subjective lived experience? Because if that's the case, we're not going to be able to argue. And clearly there are objective claims. You know, isoniazid is the cure for TB, for tuberculosis. There is no other cure for tuberculosis. Your opinion could be that NyQuil will cure tuberculosis. Well, your opinion will not make NyQuil cure tuberculosis. The objective claim that isoniazid is the cure is true because the object, isoniazid, actually cures TB. So we have to ask ourselves a question as a culture: are there objective truths about who we are, about our identity? Or is everything a matter of lived experience? So if someone says to you that everything is a matter of experience and subjective, what they're saying is, and you could ask them this, are you saying there are no objective truth claims? If they say yes, there are no objective truths, everything is a matter of personal experience, then ask the question, is it objectively true that there are no objective truth claims? Because if it's objectively true that there are no objective truth claims, then there's at least one objective truth, that there are no objective truth claims. But if that's true, then there are objective truth claims. Do you see the problem? It's a self-refuting claim. So in the end, we have to help people see that, yeah, we have all opinions. I have opinions about what my favorite soda is, what my favorite whatever is, but there are also objective claims about reality. So for example, God exists, Christianity is true. Is that a subjective claim or an objective claim? What do we think? Can my opinion make Christianity true if it's not? No. Can my opinion keep Christianity from being true if it is? No. So it turns out that's an objective claim about reality. Now, it may not be a true claim. All that's left to do once you determine something's objective is determine if it's true or false. That's all it's left to do. I could say this is a soda. Okay, that's an objective claim about an object, but it's a false claim. All that's left to determine once you determine something is objectively true or false is it true or false? So the claim about Christianity is an objective claim about reality. It might be false, it might be true, but it's not a subjective opinion. It's an objective claim based on the object known as Christianity. We have to kind of be a primer for the culture. We're going to have to teach people how to think again because we've forgotten how to think. And this postmodern notion, postmodernism just meaning that we don't have a modern view of truth, that we have an eclectic, fluid version of truth. And by the way, when I was an architect before I was a cop, and I was an architect from 85 to 88 in Santa Monica. I have a master's degree in architecture. And I will tell you that the dominant art form of architecture from 85 to 88 was this little known thing called postmodernism. Remember, these kinds of ideas start in the arts and philosophy and take 30 years to infiltrate the culture. And so we've moved away from postmodernism in the arts, but now the culture is right in the middle of it because we're always about 35 years behind.
Yeah, that's so important to know. Thank you. Susan, do you have the next question?
Yes, it's related. and it's from Katrina. What kind
Okay.
of challenges to making a case for Christ do you see as being unique to this time in history, especially as they relate to the internet, people's desire for quick sound bites, and overall indifference?
Well, I think that this idea we were talking about with critical theory is huge now. So here's the premise with critical theory, if you haven't been paying attention. The first is something called social binary, the idea that all interaction socially is built on an effort to gain power. And you have two groups, those who are oppressed and those who are the oppressors. And every single one of us can be divided and identified by where we fall. Are we in an oppressor group or an oppressed group? Now, we're in a culture, they would argue, that is dominated by old white guys. So we are at the top of the oppressor group. If you're a female, you are in the oppressed group if being compared to males. If you're a white male, you're in the oppressor group. If you're a white female, you'd be in the oppressed group. And so what you're doing is you're always in one of those two groups. But if you're a white female and you've got a black female friend, you're in the oppressor group and the black female friend is in the oppressed group. If you're a heterosexual and you've got a homosexual friend, you're in the oppressor group because the culture dominantly reflects the values of white heterosexuals. That's the argument. Now, why does that matter? Because look, I'm writing books as a old white guy. I'm in the worst category. The argument is that truth you can't trust anything that the oppressor group says. They only see things through the lens of their oppression. And so what you need is to hear from the lived experiences of those who are in the oppressed group. Those values are heightened. So, and by the way, if you are a Christian compared to non-Christians, you're in the oppressor group because the culture we're living in is dominated by a Christian worldview. And Western civilization really is the outflow of a Christian worldview, and it is. But that means if you aren't in that group and you don't hold to a Christian ethos, you don't hold to a Christian sexual ethic, you're in the oppressed group. And that means that the voices of those who are in the oppressor group are to be resisted. And the voices of those who are in the oppressed group are to be elevated. Now, can you see why it might get harder for us going? And by the way, this is being taught so. If you're in any kind of humanities in college, you're being taught some version of this at almost every kind of class you're taking. And so I think there's a whole generation that's being raised with this critical theory and you can start if you're just want to kind of put your foot in the water to see what I'm talking about. Start listening. There's some great sources that started in the 20s and 30s, but I don't want you to go back and read 100 books that trace the history of critical theory. But if you're wondering why it is you're watching riots take place, and you'll see, for example, a white female who's screaming at a black police officer and telling the black police officer that he doesn't understand. He's privileged. Doesn't understand what it is to be a black person. You run, how can that be? How can a white female be yelling at a black male, telling the black male he doesn't understand what it is to be a black male? Well, it's because the idea here is that he has already joined. He's already succumbed to the oppressor group's ideology. And she now has been awakened to the fact that she has been in the oppressor group and now has relinquished her position in that oppressor group. But the black man who's in the uniform has not yet done that. Look, I'll just point you to a couple of resources that'll help you. There's a guy named Neil Shenvi, Shenvi, Shenvi. He's half Indian. He's an apologist. He's got a website called Shenvi Apologetics. I don't know anyone who's doing better work on critical race theory and just critical theory in general than Neil Shenvi. So just Google him, and anywhere you've heard him interviewed, go listen to the interview. He does a great job of describing what we're facing in culture. And my fear, I've got a new book I've just finished it last week. My wife is still reading it chapter by chapter, and we're about ready to send it to some friends to do some fact checking, and then we're going to go ahead and send it to the publisher. And I've got to illustrate it. It's a new book on Jesus called Person of Interest. But I'm thinking to myself when I'm writing it, man, I think the culture probably has disqualified me as a voice. And I mean, I'm right here. I am as the white heterosexual male old guy who is a Christian. And these are all groups and categories that are now in the oppressor side of the equation if we believe the social binary, that you're only in one of two groups. And if that's the case, I don't know why anybody would read it. Same is true for all of you. I'm looking at all of you in this group. And as I see all of you, most of you, yeah, except for that one category that you're all women, which by the way, we need way more women involved in apologetics. Oh my gosh, there's a huge need. So as you're learning about apologetics, don't just sit there and learn about it. Don't just be content consumers. You better start to become content creators. Start a website. Start a website. Share what you've learned in this class. Start a website and start actually sharing with your friends. We need more voices. Have you noticed if you go to a conference and it's got apologetics involved, if nobody told you about the speakers, what would you guess they would look like? They're going to be old white guys, right? There's no diversity in apologetics. It's ridiculous. Why is that the case? I don't know. But that's something we're trying to remedy. We're trying to raise up voices that don't look like us, because it just seems to me like this is a culture that all we're doing is affirming the stereotype of oppression that is seen through Christianity. Trust me, they're coming after us. We spent an entire generation telling people, this was our apologetic. Hey, do you like America? Well, did you know the founding fathers? They were all Christians. Oh, no, they weren't. A couple of them were like, Jefferson wasn't really a Christian. Benjamin Franklin wasn't a Christian. Okay, fine. But I'll tell you what, everybody else is pretty much a pastor. And those two guys, they loved Christianity, even though they may not have called themselves Christians. They were in favor of it. We attached Christianity to the founding fathers for about 50 years. Well, guess what? The founding fathers have fallen out of favor. And so now have all the Christians too, because we spent so many years attaching ourselves to the founding fathers, who were all slave owners. And you probably used their Christian worldview to enable that. That's what they're going to say, right? So, I mean, what we've done is we've really, you can see why the culture is going to look at us as Christians as one of the things that has to be denied and rejected. They're not looking for us to admit, they're looking to dismantle the system of oppression. And they're going to start to see Christianity as part of that system. So just get ready. This is where we're headed. It's all a Matthew 5 thing, right? Blessed are you when people insult you. Not if, when people insult you and persecute you and falsely accuse you of all kinds of evil because of me. Okay, that's not an if, that's a when, and it's coming.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, no, it is. But listen, this is why we have to make sure we hold a real Christian worldview. If we hold we say we're Christians, but we really live every moment hanging on to those 90 years we get here on planet Earth, hoping that the material things and leaders in politics are going to save us. Well, good luck with that. We are eternal creatures who only spend 90 years in this millisecond called our temporal life. Then we spend eternity with God. Yet we live and cling on to every one of those 90 years like it's the only form of life we're ever going to experience, the only form of justice we're ever going to experience. When in fact, of course, we are eternal creatures who have been promised. Whatever you're crying about today, you won't be crying about it when you're before God in eternity. There will be no tears. So I think the part of it is we have to live as though Christianity is true. And that means we have to be bold while we're here and expect that if it ends tomorrow, that's okay. We've been promised eternity.
All right. Our next question is from our sweet friend Taylor.
Okay.
Taylor is actually on her own journey toward faith, and she struggles with the concern that believing in God is just a belief in an imaginary friend, or maybe indulging in magical thinking. How would you encourage her or respond to others who have similar struggles?
Well, if that's all it is, do not jump in. I'm not interested in willing myself towards some truth that's not true. I wouldn't be here if that was the case. No one's more skeptical or a bigger jerk about these things than me. Trust me on that. So I'm like you in the sense that I am not interested in holding on to something that works that's not true. And if it's not true, it probably won't work for very long. There's more than enough good reason. Look, when I was an atheist, I stepped across a number of unanswered questions to hold on to my atheism. How do we explain a universe that comes into existence from nothing, that appears to be fine-tuned, that life emerges from nothing, and when it does emerge, it has a signature of information in DNA and the appearance of design that's even so common that atheists will talk about it. Dawkins will tell you that all of biology is the study of things that appear to have been designed for a purpose, but he says they're not. But he admits they appear to be designed. Well, no kidding. How do we explain the appearance of design? How do we explain the immaterial thing in a material universe called consciousness? Sam Harris, who's an atheist, denies that you have a mind. He denies that you have free agency because he knows that under atheism, you can have no free agency. Under atheism, all you are is a material brain. And there are neurons, material events that are occurring in your brain over which you have no control. He says you have the illusion of free agency. But he understands that under atheism, the universe is what is called deterministic, physicalistic. Physical things like dominoes are predetermined by prior physical events. That means that all of your thoughts are illusions that are actually neurons fired by prior physical events. Starting at the beginning of the universe, this sequence of events was predetermined and unflinching. So we have an illusion of free agency. Really, without free agency, the things that we value the most, that probably you value the most, are not available to us. You cannot love if you cannot freely act to love. It's just a program. You can program something to say, I love you, but unless it can freely choose to say, I love you, it's not a real emotion. Love is not available to us unless we have free agency. Creativity is not available to us if we can't act freely. Rationality, choosing between two rational options. If you're thinking about Christianity right now, under atheism, you really don't have the option of weighing the facts and the evidence because your brain is firing for a certain reason based on its biochemistry. You're just going to come to a conclusion that was predetermined by your chemistry. There is no free agency. And if you doubt me, read Sam Harris, the atheist, who's a neuroscientist, a book called Free Will, in which he denies you have free agency because he knows atheism won't give you that. There's the problem. I didn't care about any of those problems with atheism. I was still a committed atheist. I simply stepped across the unanswered questions to hold on to my atheistic view. Now, I have unanswered questions as a Christian, but trust me, they are in a completely different category and they are not nearly as severe as the ones I had as an atheist. Yes, you're going to take a step of trust that something is true from the end of an evidence trail. And that step of trust under atheism is just called reasoning. Under Christianity, it's called a step of faith, but it's not blind. The evidence leads you in a certain direction. You take a step across your unanswered questions. I think most of us, when we're not theists, when we're just atheists, we haven't really thought about the explanations for the things we've taken for granted. Like, how did we get here? Why is there a life? Why does the life have information embedded? You realize that life in the universe is not based on physics or chemistry. And we know that now. It's based on the information in DNA, which guides the entire process from amino acids to proteins to the simple cell structures in your body. All of it is driven by a code. So I would put it this way. If I was to come into a death scene and I saw there was some blood spatter against the wall, well, I could say, I'm not sure this is even a murder. I mean, that could be caused because he fell and hit his head. Physics and chemistry will explain blood spatter. But if I get there and there's a written message in his blood that says he deserved it, now I'm looking for a killer. Because I can't explain he deserved it with just physics and chemistry. There is a he deserved it in your DNA. And you cannot explain it with physics and chemistry. Information always comes from mind. And once you realize that, you're like, I'm stuck with some form of mind, of theism. I have to step at least out of that. And then it comes down to, do these documents make sense? Do these documents, are they reliable? So I would say that I'm in the most reasonable position I could be in right now, even though I have unanswered questions. But don't think that the people who don't believe in Jesus have no unanswered questions. They just haven't even talked about those. They haven't maybe even thought about those. We all have unanswered questions. Every worldview presents you with unanswerable questions. But here in Christianity, we have the fewest and least significant unanswered questions. And that's why I'm a Christian today.
Thank you for that. Let's see. Anne, do you have the next question?
Yes, from Susan H. She says, what key points from the book would you recommend to pique someone's interest in reading it if I don't feel comfortable just giving them the whole book?
Oh, boy. That's a good one. That's a good question. Man, I don't know. That's a really good question. I'm pretty methodical about this. I have a high regard for the truth. I simply want to know what's true. I don't care where it lands me as long as I know it's true. And I'm looking for a worldview that actually describes the world the way it really is. So, I mean, I think that this is what's great about Christianity, is it describes the world the way it really is. I think what I would say is, wouldn't you like to live in the truth instead of whatever you've imagined is the truth? And that's really what I hope drives all of us, is a search to know what is true. I think in the end, it's going to come down to one piece of evidence, though, for Christianity. That's the resurrection. So if the resurrection didn't occur, it's all a joke. Get out now. It's a waste of time. If the resurrection did occur, I'm silly this way. I have a tendency to listen to people who rose from the grave. If you rise out of the grave, I'm probably going to listen to you. And that puts Jesus in a different category. So I'm thinking, if the resurrection is not true, then yet abandon it, move on to the next thing. If the resurrection is true, what I discovered, I was doing this new book I'm doing, I'm talking about ton of stuff, but one of the things I'm looking at is what kind of impact has Jesus had on other religious systems? What's really amazing is, if there's a religious system that precedes Jesus, Jesus shows up and that system bends its knee to Jesus. It modifies to adapt the nature of Christianity, or it includes Jesus somehow in its list of enlightened people, whatever it is. If it's Hinduism or Buddhism, there's a place for Jesus in those systems. If a system comes after Christianity, it always hat tips Jesus. Islam, Jesus is Isa. He is the prophet of such esteem, he is rated above Muhammad. Jesus exists in all systems following Jesus, and all systems prior to Jesus modify themselves to include Jesus. Why? It turns out, if you're interested in anything that has to do with spirituality, Jesus is a good place to start. Because although Jesus ends up in every other system, no system ends up in Christianity. Jesus does not do that for anybody else. Hinduism, that preceded. Buddhism, that preceded. There's still Buddhists in the world. There's still Hindus in the world, right? There are still Zoroastrians in the world. That preceded Jesus also. Those folks have hat-tipped Jesus. Jesus did not come in and say, well, I'm also part of that system. No, he said, there's only one way to the Father, except through me. No one sees the Father. So it turns out everyone will include Jesus, but Jesus will include no one. Isn't that interesting? So that's what happens when God shows up. Is these other systems that approximate God will want to include the real God, but the real God is not going to include the lies. So it's interesting to me that all of those systems find a place for Jesus at the table. Yet Jesus makes no room at the table for Buddha, no room at the table for Krishna, no room at the table for Baha'u'llah. The Baha'i faith includes Jesus as a manifestation, but Jesus does not include Baha'u'llah. I mean, Baha'u'llah includes Buddha as a manifestation. Jesus does not include Buddha. And Buddha preceded Jesus by hundreds of years. Yet he's not included in that theology. Why? Because this is what happens. When the truth meets a lie, lies try to incorporate the truth to tell their lie better. The truth denies the lie. That's interesting, right? I mean, if you've ever had kids who lied to you, all suspects who lie to me include the truth to tell a better lie. This is what happens also in theistic systems.
Melanie has a question.
Okay.
From what you've read or heard by Bart Ehrman, were you able to determine whether his conclusions are driven by presuppositions, emotional doubts, or something else?
Well, okay, so I told you there's only 3 reasons why anyone denies a truth claim, and you saw that in the book. But I'll tell you, I respect Bart Ehrman enough not to presume I know what his issues are. I mean, I think it would be condescending for me to say, well, Bart's doing this or Bart's doing that. I don't know what Bart's issues are. I don't know. And so I'm willing to just let that be. But it's going to fall into one of those 3 categories. Do I know which one it is? No, I really don't. But I'll just do a thought experiment with you. So Bart points out these places in Scripture where there are problems in Scripture, where there is a variation in the ancient manuscripts. I mean, I'm not sure I even said this in the book or not, but when I talk to students, I always say, okay, for the sake of argument, take out every variation. Those words that you think are different in the translations, just cut the words out of Scripture. As a matter of fact, take the entire verse where the variation exists and just cut the verse out. Take it out. Tell you what, better than that. Let's take out 25%. Every 4th verse, just take it out. You pick it. No, better than that. Let's take out 50%. You can take out all the odd verses or all the even verses. You choose. Now, after you've done that, what do you still know about Jesus? No skeptic on planet Earth thinks that 50% of the manuscript should be removed and is untrustworthy. But I just let you take it out. So take it out. Now, it turns out that most of what you've taken out, if you took it out in the Gospel of Mark, the parallel accounts that might still exist, it's going to get reinserted again. You might have taken that verse out of Mark, but you might not have taken it out of Matthew, and it's going to get reinserted again. By the time you reassemble the entire Scripture, you're still stuck with Jesus. Maybe it reads rougher, it's choppier, because you've taken out every other verse, but trust me, you're still stuck with the dude who was born of a virgin, who lived and started his ministry at 30, was baptized by John the Baptist, who ministered for 3 years, died on a cross, rose from the grave, ascended into heaven. You're stuck with that dude, no matter how much you take out. So what are we even having this conversation for? I'm willing to give you far more than Bart Ehrman is wanting you to take out, and you're still stuck with Jesus. So as a thought experiment, I'm not even sure why we're even having that conversation. I mean, you can do all the textual criticism you want. You can redact that thing as heavy as you want to redact it. You're stuck with Jesus.
All right. We're getting close to the end of our time. So before we go to the last question, I just wanted to remind everyone that on November 10th, we're going to have Lindsay Medenwalt of Mama Bear Apologetics. Hi, Lindsay. She's going to give us a presentation on world religions and how to prepare for missionaries at your door.
Excellent.
And then on December 8th, we will have another guest speaker give a talk on apologetics related to Christmas topics. Then on January 5th, we'll be resuming our weekly discussions on our new book selection, which is The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. And we do know that we will have another author Q&A for that book as well. So exciting. So make sure you invite your friends and request the Zoom links because they will be different for each of those events. And you can do that by contacting us on Facebook, Instagram, on our website, or you can email us at girltalkapologetics@gmail.com. Okay. So finally, the final question was going to be if we can look forward to reading more books by J. Warner Wallace, and if so, what the topic might be, but you've already kind of answered that one.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit more because I just finished it last week, and it's almost to the publisher. So what I try to do is this next book is called Person of Interest. What we're doing is we're saying, hey, what if you had no New Testament at all? You had everything, every New Testament's been destroyed. Every Christian Bible has been destroyed. What would you still know about Jesus? Well, similarly, I have to work these cases called no body missings, and that's where your husband kills his wife and buries the body, and then says to everybody that she ran off. And we investigate. No one even takes a murder report. It takes basically a missing persons report. And then 5 years later, she never returns. And we're like, that doesn't sound quite right. This is probably a murder, not a missing persons report. So now we open a murder investigation, but we have no crime scene. No pictures were taken. No physical evidence was collected, and we have no body. How do you make a case? How do you show that that husband is the person of interest, the killer, when you have no crime scene and no body? Well, how you do it in front of a jury is you just demonstrate that when the crime occurred on that day that he killed her, it's like a bomb went off, a bomb of violence against his wife. But that bomb was preceded by a fuse that burned for months and years until finally it ignited a bomb. And after the bomb exploded, there was shrapnel everywhere. Well, it turns out I can demonstrate what happened on the day the bomb exploded from just the fuse and the fallout. Well, what we're going to do with Jesus is talk about the fuse that burns up in history to the appearance of Jesus and the fallout that occurs in history after Jesus. And even if we had no crime scene, no New Testament, you would still be able to reconstruct the entire story of Jesus from just the fuse and the fallout. And that's what we're doing. It's called Person of Interest. It's also the subtitle is Why Jesus Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible.
Sounds like a book we may need to add to our list, ladies.
Yeah, I hope so. We're getting there. We're getting close. But hey, thank you so much, all of you, for having me at your book study. I really appreciate that you even reach out to authors. I hope either Gary or Mike is going to come for the next one. And I just want to say thank you to all of you. Have a great holiday, very joyous holiday. And I think you're going to really enjoy Mike and Gary's book. They're great. They're great guys. I was just with Mike Licona all weekend at a conference in Tucson. So you're going to enjoy his book.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks, Patty. I appreciate you. Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night, ladies.